When retired Marine Thomas Brennan paid $5 for an abandoned flour mill at a county auction, he thought he'd found the perfect place to disappear from the world. He was wrong. What he found instead was a secret so dangerous that powerful people had spent decades ensuring it stayed buried. His German Shepherd Ranger wouldn't stop digging at the mill's foundation. The dog knew something was hidden beneath those ancient stones, something worth killing for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Susquehanna River like a shroud, transforming the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania into something from a forgotten dream. Thomas Brennan sat in his weathered pickup truck, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stared at the crumbling structure before him. The Hartwell flour mill stood like a monument to industrial decay, its red brick walls stained dark with decades of neglect, the massive wooden water wheel frozen in time, half submerged in the slow-moving creek that had once powered its grinding stones. At 46, Thomas carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much and said too little. His sandy brown hair, cropped short in the style that never quite left former military men, was threaded with premature gray at the temples. 3 tours in Afghanistan had carved lines around his green eyes, lines that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions made in the heat of battle. He wore his civilian uniform of faded jeans, work boots, and a plain gray Henley with the same unconscious precision he had once worn dress blues. Beside him in the passenger seat, Ranger lifted his massive head and studied the mill with the same intensity his master showed. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, his black and tan coat showing the first touches of silver around his muzzle. Like Thomas, he was a veteran, though his service had been of a different kind. Ranger had spent 4 years as a military working dog, specializing in explosive detection. His nose had saved countless lives in the dusty streets of Kandahar and the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. When an IED had damaged his left hind leg, ending his active duty, the military had been ready to retire him permanently. Thomas, facing his own medical discharge after shrapnel from the same blast had torn through his shoulder, had requested to adopt his partner. They had been inseparable ever since. The auction had taken place in the courthouse basement of Millerville, a town that time had passed by with barely a glance. Thomas had come not looking for property, but simply to kill time on a rainy Tuesday morning. He had been living in a cramped apartment above Murphy's hardware store for 6 months, working odd jobs and trying to figure out what came next for a man whose only real skills involved things the civilian world had little use for. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a voice like gravel, had moved through the lots with the enthusiasm of someone selling week-old fish. When he reached lot 17, the Hartwell mill, his tone had become almost apologetic. The property consisted of the mill building itself, 42 acres of overgrown farmland, and a small caretaker's cottage that the county assessor had charitably described as habitable. The mill had been abandoned since 1987, when the last owner, an elderly man named Edwin Hartwell, had died without heirs. For 36 years it had sat empty while the county tried to figure out what to do with it. Property taxes had gone unpaid, liens had accumulated, and the state had finally decided to cut its losses. The bidding had opened at $50. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer dropped it to $25. Still nothing. At $10, a few people had shifted in their seats, but no hands went up. Thomas had watched the faces around him, seeing something he recognized from his military days. It was the look people got when they knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite put their finger on what. Fear mixed with superstition, the kind of unease that kept soldiers awake on quiet nights in hostile territory. When the auctioneer had called for $5, Thomas had surprised himself by raising his hand. The gavel had come down with a sharp crack that echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. "Congratulations," the auctioneer had said, his voice carrying a note of sympathy that Thomas hadn't understood at the time. "You are now the proud owner of the Hartwell mill." The paperwork had taken less than an hour. The deed, yellowed with age and bearing the official seal of Monroe County, now rested in the glove compartment of his truck. As he had walked out of the courthouse, an elderly woman in a worn wool coat had approached him. She was small and bird-like, with intelligent blue eyes that held a lifetime of small-town secrets. "You're the one who bought the mill," she had said. "It wasn't a question. I'm Margaret Kowalski. My family's lived in this valley for 80 years. Thomas had nodded politely, waiting to see what she had to say. "I suppose folks tried to warn you off," she had continued, studying his face with the intensity of someone taking his measure. "They always do. Got their reasons, I suppose, though most of them don't know the half of it." "What kind of reasons?" Thomas had asked. Margaret had looked around the courthouse steps, making sure they weren't overheard. "Strange things happened at that mill," she had said quietly. "Back in the 80s, before old Edwin died, government men coming and going at all hours. Big black cars with tinted windows. Edwin used to be chatty, always ready with a story and a cup of coffee. But toward the end, he got scared. Real scared. Stopped talking to folks. Stopped coming to town except when he absolutely had to." She had paused, her eyes searching Thomas's face for signs of whether he was taking her seriously. "Found him dead in his cottage one morning. Heart attack," the coroner said. But Margaret's voice had dropped to a whisper. But there were things that didn't add up. His place had been tossed, like someone was looking for something, and those government men, they came back after the funeral. Spent 3 days going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. "What were they looking for?" Thomas had asked. Margaret had shrugged. "Nobody knows for sure. But Edwin's nephew, he tried to claim the property after the funeral. Nice young man, college-educated, had plans to restore the mill, but funny thing happened. Those government men paid him a visit, and suddenly he didn't want any part of it. Signed papers giving up his claim, and moved to California. Haven't heard from him since." She had pulled her coat tighter against the autumn chill. "All I'm saying is be careful. That mill's got secrets, and sometimes secrets are better left buried." Now, sitting in his truck with Ranger, Thomas understood why the auction room had gone so quiet when Lot 17 came up. This wasn't just about an old mill. It was about fear, the kind that settled into a community's bones and stayed there for decades. But Thomas had faced fear before, in places where it wore the face of enemy combatants and improvised explosive devices. An old flour mill in rural Pennsylvania seemed manageable by comparison. He opened the truck door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The creek that ran alongside the mill burbled softly, its voice the only sound in the profound quiet that seemed to envelop the property. Ranger leaped down from the passenger seat and immediately began his own reconnaissance, nose to the ground, working in the systematic pattern Thomas had watched him use hundreds of times in Afghanistan. Even in retirement, the dog approached new terrain like the professional he had been trained to be. The mill itself was larger than it had appeared from the truck. The main building was 3 stories tall, its red brick walls rising from a foundation of massive fieldstones that looked older than the structure itself. The water wheel, though motionless, was an impressive piece of engineering, its wooden paddles weathered gray but still solid. Someone had taken care to maintain it, even as the rest of the building had been allowed to decay. Windows on the upper floors were boarded over with plywood that had warped and buckled with age, giving the building a blank, eyeless appearance that was somehow unsettling. Thomas walked to the heavy wooden door that served as the main entrance. A newer-looking padlock secured it, but the wood around the latch was soft with rot. A firm pull was all it took to tear the hardware free. The door swung open on rusted hinges, releasing a smell of must, old flour, and something else, something chemical and sharp that made his nose wrinkle. The interior was a cathedral of industrial archaeology. Massive wooden beams, black with age, supported the ceiling. The original grinding stones sat in the center of the main floor, each one easily 6 feet across and carved from dense granite. They were connected by a complex system of wooden gears and leather belts that had once transferred power from the water wheel to the mill's grinding mechanism. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that sparkled in the shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the boarded windows. Ranger entered behind him, immediately alert. The dog's posture had changed from curious to cautious, his ears forward, his tail held low. He began working the room in a systematic pattern, his nose processing information that Thomas's human senses couldn't detect. After a few minutes, the dog stopped at a section of the stone foundation that ran along the north wall. He whined softly, a sound Thomas had learned to interpret as interest mixed with concern. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, walking over to where Ranger stood. The dog was focused on a particular stone in the foundation, one that looked identical to all the others to Thomas's untrained eye. But Ranger's nose never lied. There was something different about this spot, something that had caught the attention of a dog trained to find things that were meant to stay hidden. Thomas knelt beside his partner and ran his hands over the stones. At first he felt nothing unusual, but as he worked his way along the wall, his fingers detected something that made him pause. One of the stones felt different. Where the others were firmly set in their mortar bed, this one had the slightest bit of give to it, as if it wasn't quite as solidly placed as the rest. He pressed harder, and the stone shifted almost imperceptibly. Thomas sat back on his heels, his mind working through the implications. In Afghanistan, he had learned to pay attention to things that weren't quite right, details that stood out from the established pattern. Those small inconsistencies often marked the difference between a safe path and a deadly one. Ranger remained focused on the stone, occasionally pawing at it with the same intensity he had once shown when alerting to explosive devices. Thomas trusted that nose more than he trusted his own eyes. If Ranger thought there was something worth investigating here, then there was. He walked back to his truck and retrieved a small toolkit from the bed. Among the contents was a sturdy pry bar, perfect for the kind of detailed work he suspected he was about to undertake. Ranger watched approvingly as Thomas returned to the foundation wall, tool in hand.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Working carefully, Thomas inserted the flat end of the pry bar into the mortar joint around the suspicious stone. The mortar crumbled away easily, too easily for something that should have been set for decades. As he worked, it became clear that this wasn't original construction. Someone had removed this stone at some point and replaced it, doing a good job of disguising their work, but not good enough to fool a dog's nose or a careful examination. After 20 minutes of patient work, the stone came free with a grinding scrape that echoed through the empty mill. Behind it was not more stone or earth, but darkness. Thomas peered into the hole and found himself looking at a cavity that extended back into the foundation further than his flashlight beam could reach. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small LED flashlight, a habit from his military days when being prepared for darkness was a matter of survival. The beam revealed a carefully constructed hiding place, carved out of the earth behind the foundation and lined with flat stones to prevent collapse. It was maybe 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, just large enough to hide something substantial, and something was hidden there. Thomas could see the edge of what looked like a wooden crate, pushed far back into the deepest part of the cavity. Ranger whined again, his agitation increasing as the smell from the hidden space grew stronger with the stone removed. Getting the crate out required crawling partway into the hiding place, something Thomas's damaged shoulder protested vigorously, but persistence paid off. The wooden container was smaller than he had expected, maybe the size of a briefcase, but heavy enough to suggest it contained something substantial. It was made of some kind of hardwood, possibly oak, with brass corner reinforcements that had turned green with age. A simple latch held it closed, secured with a small brass padlock that looked far newer than the crate itself. Thomas carried his prize to a patch of sunlight near the mill's main entrance. Ranger stayed close, his attention fixed on the wooden box with an intensity that suggested whatever was inside was significant indeed. The brass padlock was solid, but not particularly sophisticated. A few minutes with a small hammer from his toolkit was all it took to break it free. The lid opened with a soft creak, releasing a smell of old paper and leather that overwhelmed even the mustiness of the mill. Inside, Thomas found himself looking at a collection of items that made no immediate sense but clearly represented something important to whoever had hidden them. On top was a stack of photographs, black and white images that looked like they had been taken in the 1980s based on the clothing and cars visible in some of the shots. The photos showed the mill itself, but not as Thomas had found it. In these images, the mill was clearly active. Trucks were parked outside, men in suits were walking in and out of the building, and what looked like construction or renovation work was taking place around the water wheel. Beneath the photographs was a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by handling. Thomas opened it carefully, revealing page after page of handwritten notes in a neat, precise script. The entries were dated, beginning in March of 1983 and continuing through August of 1987. They appeared to be the observations of someone who was watching the mill very carefully and recording everything they saw. March 15, 1983. The first entry read, "They arrived this morning just after dawn, 3 black sedans with government plates. The man in charge is tall, maybe 6'2", with prematurely grey hair and the bearing of someone used to giving orders. I counted at least 8 men total, all wearing identical dark suits despite the warm weather. They seemed very interested in the mill's foundation, particularly the north wall." Thomas flipped through several pages, each one documenting visits by what the writer clearly believed were government agents. The observations were detailed and precise, noting the times of arrival and departure, descriptions of vehicles and personnel, and most importantly, what activities were taking place at the mill. April 3, 1983. Construction equipment arrived today, a small excavator and a concrete mixer truck. The work is being done inside the mill, but I can see lights burning late into the night. Whatever they're doing, it's not restoration. They're changing something fundamental about the building's structure. May 20, 1983. Transport today. 2 trucks with covered beds arrived around midnight. I couldn't see what they were carrying, but it took 6 men to move each crate from the trucks into the mill. Heavy items, handled with extreme care. The men all wore protective gear, gloves, masks, even what looked like hazmat suits for some of the work. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. Whatever had been happening at the mill in the 1980s, it wasn't the legitimate operation of a flour mill. Someone had been using the building for something else entirely, something that required secrecy and government involvement. He continued reading, watching as the journal entries became increasingly concerned. The unknown observer had clearly become worried about what they were witnessing. June 12, 1983. I think I know what they're storing here. The vehicles, the protective equipment, the way they handle everything. This is radioactive material. The mill is being used as some kind of secret storage facility. But storage for what? And why here, in a small town where no one would think to look? July 4, 1983. Independence Day. But there's nothing independent about what's happening here. More deliveries last night. I counted 12 trucks this time, all with government markings. The security is getting tighter too. They've posted guards around the perimeter, and I've had to be much more careful about my observations if they catch me watching. The entries continued for 4 more years, documenting what appeared to be an ongoing operation that used the mill as a secret government storage facility. But it was the final entries that made Thomas's blood run cold. August 10, 1987. Something's gone wrong. The men in hazmat suits have been here for 3 days straight. I can see them through the windows, working frantically on something inside the mill. The Geiger counter I borrowed from the university is clicking like crazy whenever I get within 100 yards of the building. August 15th, 1987. Edwin confronted them today. I watched through binoculars as he stood on his front porch, yelling at the man in charge. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. Edwin wanted them gone. The gray-haired man listened for a few minutes, then said something that made Edwin go very pale. Whatever was said, it scared him badly. August 22nd, 1987. They're cleaning up. Trucks have been coming and going for the past week, taking things away instead of bringing them in. But they're not taking everything. I can tell by the way they're moving, the precautions they're still taking. Some of whatever they stored here is staying behind. August 28th, 1987. This is my last entry. Edwin died 3 days ago. Heart attack, they say. But I know better. He was scared of something, and now he's dead. I'm scared too. If they killed Edwin to keep him quiet, what would they do to someone who's been watching and recording their activities for 4 years? I'm leaving town tomorrow. But first I'm going to hide this journal and the photographs where someone might find them someday. Maybe someone brave enough to do what I couldn't. Tell the world what really happened at the Hartwell Mill. Thomas closed the journal, his mind reeling from what he had just read. If the unknown observer was correct, the mill had been used as a secret government storage facility for radioactive materials. Some of those materials might still be here, hidden somewhere in the building he was now sitting in. He looked at Ranger, who was still focused intently on the open crate. The dog's training had been in explosive detection, but Thomas knew that military working dogs were often cross-trained in other specialties. Could Ranger be detecting radiation? Was that what had drawn his attention to the hidden stone in the first place? Beneath the journal, Thomas found a manila envelope containing what appeared to be official documents. The letterhead read, Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Security, and the documents were stamped with classifications that Thomas recognized from his military service. These were authentic government papers, not the fabrications of a conspiracy theorist. The documents told a story that was even more disturbing than the journal entries. In 1983, the Department of Energy had been quietly disposing of radioactive waste from decommissioned nuclear weapons. The official disposal sites were reaching capacity, and public scrutiny was making it difficult to transport materials to authorized facilities. Someone had come up with the idea of using abandoned industrial sites as temporary storage locations. The Hartwell Mill had been chosen because of its remote location, its solid construction, and its owner's financial difficulties. Edwin Hartwell had been approached by government agents and offered a substantial sum of money to allow the use of his mill for what they described as agricultural equipment storage. The old man, struggling to pay his bills and maintain the property, had agreed, but what the government had actually stored there was far more dangerous than agricultural equipment. According to the documents, the mill had been used to house plutonium-contaminated soil and equipment from the Rocky Flats facility in Colorado, one of the most polluted sites in the American nuclear weapons complex. The material was supposed to have been temporary storage, just until permanent disposal sites could be prepared. But as Thomas read through the papers, it became clear that the temporary arrangement had become permanent through bureaucratic inertia and budget constraints. The waste had been sealed in concrete containers and hidden in a specially constructed vault beneath the mill's foundation. Then in 1987, everything had gone wrong. A routine inspection had revealed that some of the containers were leaking. The contamination was spreading through the groundwater, threatening not just the immediate area, but the entire Susquehanna River watershed. A cleanup operation had been hastily organized, but according to the documents, they had been unable to remove all of the contaminated material. Some of it was too deeply buried, too dangerous to move without risking a major radiation release. The decision had been made to seal the vault permanently and classify the entire operation at the highest levels of government secrecy. Edwin Hartwell, who had become aware of the danger and threatened to go public, had been silenced through means the documents didn't specify but Thomas could guess at. The final document in the envelope was a schematic of the mill, showing the location of the hidden vault. According to the diagram, it was directly beneath the main grinding floor, accessible through a concealed entrance near the water wheel mechanism. Thomas stood up, the full implications of his discovery hitting him like a physical blow. He had bought more than an abandoned mill. He had bought a secret nuclear waste site, one that the government had covered up for over 30 years. The radioactive materials were still here, still contaminating the ground and water, still posing a threat to anyone who came too close. And now he knew about it. Ranger was on his feet as well, pacing nervously around the mill's interior. The dog's agitation was increasing, as if he could sense something that Thomas couldn't. Thomas knew from experience that Ranger's instincts were rarely wrong. If the dog was worried, there was good reason to be. The sound of vehicles approaching broke the morning quiet. Thomas moved to one of the unboarded windows and peered out, his military training automatically assessing the situation. Two black SUVs were making their way down the overgrown access road to the mill, their tinted windows reflecting the early sunlight. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of an official convoy, not the casual approach of curious neighbors or local officials. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. The documents in the crate represented evidence of a massive government cover-up, proof that radioactive waste had been illegally dumped and then concealed for decades. If the wrong people knew he had found them, his life could be in serious danger. He quickly gathered the photographs, journal, and documents, stuffing them back into the wooden crate. There was no time to return them to their hiding place in the foundation. Instead, he carried the crate to the back of the mill, where a narrow staircase led to the upper floors. He climbed quickly, Ranger close behind him, and found a small storage room on the second floor. He shoved the crate behind a pile of old grain sacks, covering it as best he could. The vehicles had stopped outside the mill. Thomas could hear car doors slamming, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps on the wooden porch. He made his way to a window that offered a view of the front entrance and carefully peered down. 3 men in dark suits were standing near the mill's entrance, studying the building with the practiced eye of professionals. One of them, a tall man with prematurely gray hair, matched the description from the journal entries perfectly. If this was the same man who had been in charge of the operation in the 1980s, he would now be in his 70s, but still carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Thomas recognized the type from his military service. These were intelligence operatives, the kind of men who spent their careers in the shadows, cleaning up messes that could embarrass or endanger the government. They had come here for a reason, and Thomas suspected that reason had something to do with his purchase of the mill. One of the men was speaking into a radio, his voice too low for Thomas to make out the words. The gray-haired man was examining the forced lock on the mill's front door, his expression grim. They knew someone had been inside. The question was whether they knew who. Thomas felt Ranger press against his leg, the dog's warmth a comforting reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. Whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they had faced the dangers of Afghanistan. The difference was that this time, the enemy wasn't foreign insurgents in a distant land. This time the threat was coming from his own government, and there was nowhere to run. The gray-haired man gestured to his companions, and all 3 moved toward the mill's entrance. In a few moments, they would be inside, searching for evidence of who had discovered their secret. Thomas had to decide quickly whether to confront them or try to remain hidden. His military training told him that discretion was the better part of valor, especially when outnumbered and outgunned. But as he watched the men enter the mill below, Thomas realized that hiding wasn't really an option. These people had been covering up a dangerous secret for over 30 years. They had likely been responsible for Edwin Hartwell's death, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate another threat. His only real choice was to be proactive, to find a way to expose the truth before they could silence him permanently. The sound of footsteps echoed through the mill as the three men began their search. They moved with the systematic efficiency of professionals, checking every corner, every possible hiding place. It was only a matter of time before they made their way to the upper floors. Thomas looked at Ranger, who was watching him with the unwavering trust that had sustained them both through the darkest days of their military service. The dog had led him to the hidden crate, to the evidence that could expose a massive government conspiracy. Now it was up to Thomas to figure out what to do with that knowledge. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. Through the window, Thomas could see additional SUVs pulling up to the mill, disgorging more men in dark suits. Whatever was hidden beneath the mill was important enough to warrant a significant response. These people were taking no chances. Thomas knew he was trapped, outnumbered, and facing an enemy with resources and authority far beyond his own. But he also knew something they didn't know he knew. He had found their secret, documented their crime, and now he had to find a way to survive long enough to tell the world about it. The footsteps below were getting closer to the staircase. In a few minutes, they would be up here, and his brief advantage would be lost. Thomas made his decision. He wasn't going to hide and wait for them to find him. He was going to take the fight to them, using the skills the military had taught him, and the element of surprise they wouldn't expect from a small-town veteran who had bought a mill for $5. Ranger seemed to sense his determination. The dog's posture shifted from defensive to alert, ready to follow his partner into whatever came next. They had survived one war together. Now they were about to begin another, one where the stakes were just as high, but the enemy wore familiar faces and spoke with American accents. The battle for the truth was about to begin. The footsteps below had stopped. Thomas pressed himself against the wall of the second-floor storage room, straining to hear what the men were doing. Ranger crouched beside him, every muscle tense, his ears rotating like radar dishes picking up the slightest sound. The silence stretched on, more unnerving than any noise would have been. Thomas knew this tactic from his military training. The operatives were listening too, trying to determine if anyone was in the building. They had seen the broken lock, the disturbed dust patterns, the signs that someone had been exploring the mill. Now they were waiting, hoping that whoever had been here might reveal themselves through carelessness or panic. A soft creaking from the first floor indicated movement. Thomas could picture the gray-haired man gesturing silently to his companions, directing them to spread out and search methodically. These weren't amateur thugs or local muscle. These were professionals who had spent decades keeping dangerous secrets buried. The sound of boots on wooden stairs echoed through the mill as one of the men began climbing to the second floor. Thomas moved deeper into the storage room, positioning himself behind a stack of old grain sacks. Ranger followed, understanding without words that silence was crucial. The dog had operated in hostile territory before and knew how to remain invisible when necessary. Thomas could hear the man moving through the second floor, checking each room systematically. The footsteps grew closer, and Thomas caught a glimpse of a figure passing the doorway of the storage room. The man was younger than the gray-haired leader, maybe 45, with the lean build of someone who stayed in excellent physical condition. He wore an expensive suit, but moved with the confidence of someone equally comfortable in combat gear. The operative paused at the doorway, scanning the room with the practiced eye of a professional. His gaze swept over the grain sacks, the old mill equipment, the dusty floor. For a moment, Thomas was certain they had been spotted. But the man's attention was drawn to something else, a set of fresh footprints in the dust near the window. Thomas realized with a sinking feeling that he had left a clear trail of his movements through the mill. The operatives would be able to reconstruct his path, determine what he had been looking at, and eventually discover the hiding place in the foundation. It was only a matter of time before they found evidence that the secret cache had been disturbed. The operative spoke into a small radio device. "Second floor clear, but we have fresh footprints up here. Whoever was here left in a hurry." The response crackled back, too distorted for Thomas to make out the words, but the operative's expression grew more serious. "Copy that. I'm heading back down." As the man's footsteps receded down the stairs, Thomas allowed himself to breathe again, but the relief was temporary. He could hear more activity outside, additional vehicles arriving, voices coordinating a search pattern. Whatever this operation was, it was expanding rapidly. Thomas knew he had to get out of the mill, but the front entrance was clearly being watched. He needed another option. Moving carefully through the storage room, he made his way to a window that faced the back of the building. The mill was built into a hillside, and the second floor opened onto what had once been a loading platform for grain wagons. The drop to the ground was manageable, maybe 12 feet, and there was cover in the form of overgrown brush and old farm equipment. But first he needed the evidence. The wooden crate hidden behind the grain sacks contained the only proof of what had really happened at the mill. Without it, he would be just another conspiracy theorist making wild claims about government cover-ups. With it, he had documentation that could expose a scandal reaching the highest levels of power. He retrieved the crate, hefting its familiar weight. Ranger watched him intently, understanding that they were preparing to move. The dog had that alert stillness that preceded action, ready to follow wherever Thomas led. The window was old and painted shut, but years of Pennsylvania weather had weakened the seal. Thomas worked at it carefully, trying to avoid making noise that would alert the men below. After several tense minutes, the window gave way with a soft crack. He pushed it open slowly, wincing at every small sound. The view from the window confirmed his worst fears. The mill was surrounded. He could see at least 6 men positioned around the building, all wearing dark suits and speaking into radio devices. 2 more SUVs had arrived while he was hiding upstairs, and Thomas could see additional personnel setting up what looked like a command post near the main road. This wasn't a simple cleanup operation. This was a full-scale containment effort, the kind of response reserved for major security breaches. Someone very important wanted to make sure that whatever Thomas had discovered never saw the light of day.
But the back of the mill was less heavily guarded. Thomas could see only one operative positioned near the water wheel, and his attention seemed focused on the creek and the approaches from that direction. If Thomas could get out the window and reach the tree line without being spotted, he might have a chance. He secured the wooden crate under his arm and swung one leg over the windowsill. The loading platform was about 3 feet below the window, giving him a stable place to land before making the final drop to the ground. Ranger watched anxiously as Thomas prepared to climb out. The dog couldn't make the same exit. The drop was too far for his injured leg, and landing wrong could seriously hurt him. Thomas would have to find another way to get his partner out of the building, but as he hesitated, trying to figure out how to solve the problem, Ranger made the decision for him. The dog had spotted something that Thomas had missed, a narrow wooden ramp that connected the loading platform to the ground. It had been used to roll heavy barrels and grain sacks down from the second floor, and while it was weathered and probably not entirely safe, it was still intact. Thomas climbed back into the room and moved to where he could see the ramp. It was steep and covered with moss, but it looked like it would support Ranger's weight. The dog seemed to understand the plan and positioned himself at the edge of the platform. Moving as quietly as possible, Thomas climbed out the window and lowered himself onto the loading platform. The wood creaked under his weight, but held firm. He set the crate down carefully and turned to help Ranger through the window. The dog came through with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, despite his old injury. He assessed the ramp with the same professional judgment he had once applied to dangerous terrain in Afghanistan, then began picking his way down with careful, deliberate steps. Thomas followed, carrying the crate and trying to keep his footing on the slippery wooden surface. Each step seemed to echo like thunder in the morning quiet, but the sounds of activity around the front of the mill masked their movement. They reached the ground without incident, but now came the most dangerous part. The tree line was 50 yards away across open ground, with no cover except for some rusted farm equipment and piles of old lumber.
The operative near the water wheel was still focused on the creek, but a shift in his attention could spot them easily. Thomas studied the guard's pattern of movement. The man was walking a regular patrol route, taking about 2 minutes to complete a circuit around the water wheel and the adjacent mill race. When he turned away to check the far side of his area, there would be a window of opportunity to cross the open ground. Thomas waited for the guard to begin his turn, then sprinted toward the tree line with Ranger close behind. The crate was awkward to carry while running, and Thomas could feel his damaged shoulder protesting the strain, but adrenaline and desperation carried him forward. They reached the cover of the trees just as the guard completed his turn. Thomas pressed himself against the trunk of a massive oak tree, breathing hard and listening for any sign that they had been spotted. But the sounds from the mill continued unchanged. Voices, radio chatter, the systematic search for evidence of an intruder. Ranger appeared beside him, panting but alert. The dog had made the crossing without any apparent difficulty, his military training serving him well in this civilian operation. Thomas reached down and scratched behind his partner's ears, a gesture of gratitude and affection that had become ritual between them. But they weren't safe yet. The tree line provided concealment, not security. Soon the operatives would expand their search beyond the immediate area around the mill. Thomas needed to get back to his truck and put distance between himself and whatever forces were converging on the Hartwell mill. The problem was that his pickup was parked near the mill's main entrance, directly in the sightline of multiple guards. Retrieving it would mean walking into the middle of the operation, something that would guarantee capture or worse. Thomas considered his options. He could abandon the truck and try to make it to town on foot, but that would mean traveling several miles through countryside with limited cover. The wooden crate would slow him down, and there was no guarantee that the operatives hadn't already identified him and posted people at likely escape routes. Alternatively, he could hide in the woods and wait for the search to move on, but that assumed the operatives would eventually give up and leave. Given the scale of the response he was witnessing, that seemed unlikely. These people were here to stay until they found what they were looking for. As he wrestled with the problem, Thomas heard a new sound that changed everything. The distinctive whop-whop-hop of helicopter rotor blades echoed across the valley, growing louder as the aircraft approached. Within moments, a black helicopter appeared over the mill, circling the area in a pattern that suggested aerial surveillance rather than transport. The helicopter was unmarked but clearly military or intelligence in origin. Its presence confirmed what Thomas had already suspected. This operation involved resources and authority far beyond local law enforcement. Someone with serious pull had decided that the Hartwell mill represented a threat worth mobilizing significant assets to contain. The helicopter's arrival also solved his transportation problem. Every eye would be on the aircraft, every radio channel focused on coordinating with the new asset. In the confusion and distraction, Thomas might be able to reach his truck without being noticed. He waited until the helicopter had completed several orbits around the mill, drawing the attention of every operative in the area. Then he began working his way through the trees toward where he had parked his pickup. The route was indirect, following a creek bed that provided natural concealment, but it kept him out of sight of the guards. Ranger followed silently, his nose constantly working to detect any threats ahead of their path. The dog's senses were invaluable in this kind of operation, providing early warning of dangers that Thomas might miss. The creek bed led them to within 20 yards of the parking area. Thomas could see his truck exactly where he had left it, but two operatives were now standing near it, obviously having identified it as belonging to whoever had been exploring the mill. One of them was speaking into a radio, while the other examined the vehicle's license plate. Thomas realized that his truck was now compromised. Even if he could reach it, driving away would immediately identify him to the operatives. They would have his plate number, his registration information, and within hours they would know everything about Thomas Brennan, retired Marine, current resident of Millerville, Pennsylvania. But abandoning the truck meant abandoning any hope of a quick escape. The wooden crate was too heavy and awkward to carry for miles through rough terrain, especially with his shoulder injury. And Ranger, despite his excellent conditioning, was 7 years old with an old injury of his own. A long forced march was not a realistic option. As Thomas considered his increasingly limited options, one of the operatives near his truck received a radio call that made both men suddenly alert. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but their body language suggested urgency. After a brief exchange, both men left the parking area and jogged toward the mill. Thomas didn't waste time wondering what had prompted their departure. He sprinted from the tree line to his truck, Ranger keeping pace beside him. The vehicle was unlocked, exactly as he had left it, and Thomas quickly verified that the keys were still in the ignition. He placed the wooden crate carefully on the passenger seat and gestured for Ranger to jump into the truck bed. The dog complied without hesitation, settling into the familiar position he had occupied during countless trips around Pennsylvania. Thomas started the engine, trying to keep the sound muted by applying minimal throttle. The old pickup responded with its usual reliable rumble, and he began backing out of the parking space as quietly as possible. The truck had moved maybe 50 feet, when Thomas heard shouts from the direction of the mill. He had been spotted. There was no longer any point in trying to be stealthy. He floored the accelerator, and the pickup lurched forward, tires spinning on the loose gravel of the access road. In the rearview mirror, he could see figures running toward vehicles parked near the mill. The helicopter, which had been circling at a distance, immediately changed course and began following his truck. Within moments, the sound of engines starting echoed across the valley as the pursuit began. Thomas had one advantage: he knew these roads. He had spent months exploring the back country around Millerville, learning the network of farm roads, logging trails and abandoned mining tracks that crisscrossed the region. His pursuers might have superior vehicles and equipment, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory. The access road connected to Route 15, about 2 miles from the mill. Thomas could take the highway and try to outrun his pursuers, but the SUVs he had seen at the mill were clearly designed for high-speed pursuit. His old pickup, reliable as it was, couldn't compete in a straight race. Instead, he turned onto a narrow farm road that led deeper into the hills. The road was barely wide enough for one vehicle and filled with potholes and washouts that would challenge any driver unfamiliar with the route. It wasn't fast, but it was treacherous enough to slow down pursuit and maybe even disable a vehicle if the driver made a mistake. The helicopter stayed with him, circling overhead like a mechanical vulture. Thomas knew it was providing real-time intelligence to the ground units, coordinating their movements and eliminating any hope of losing the pursuit through misdirection. But the helicopter also had limitations. The rolling hills and thick forest canopy made it difficult to maintain constant visual contact, and the narrow roads forced the aircraft to stay high enough to avoid power lines and radio towers, reducing the effectiveness of its surveillance. Thomas pushed the pickup as hard as he dared on the winding road. In the truck bed, Ranger rode with the steady balance of an experienced traveler, adjusting his position as the vehicle swayed and bounced through the turns. The farm road intersected with an old logging trail that Thomas had explored several weeks earlier. The trail was even narrower than the road, with tree branches scraping against both sides of the truck, but it led to an abandoned quarry where heavy equipment had created a network of service roads that might confuse his pursuers. He made the turn onto the logging trail just as the first SUV appeared in his rearview mirror. The black vehicle was gaining ground rapidly on the better road surface, but now it would have to navigate the same challenging terrain that was slowing Thomas down. The logging trail twisted through dense woods for about a mile before opening into the quarry area. Thomas had studied this location during his earlier explorations, recognizing it as a potential defensive position if he ever needed one. The quarry was surrounded by high stone walls with only 2 access points, creating natural choke points that could be defended by a small force against a larger one. But defense wasn't his goal today. Today he needed escape, and the quarry offered something even more valuable: multiple exit routes that weren't visible from the air.
The heavy equipment that had worked the quarry had carved roads leading in several directions, some of which connected to other trail systems that could take him miles from his current position. Thomas drove into the quarry at high speed, his truck bouncing over the rough ground. Behind him, he could see dust clouds marking the approach of his pursuers. The helicopter had fallen behind, forced to climb higher to clear the quarry walls. At the far end of the quarry, Thomas took a sharp left onto a service road that led up and out of the excavated area. The road was steep and narrow, cut into the hillside with a sheer drop on one side. It was the kind of route that required total concentration and left no room for error. Halfway up the hill, Thomas heard the sound of engines echoing from the quarry below. His pursuers had reached the area, but now faced the same choice. He had multiple exit routes, with no clear indication of which one their target had taken. The helicopter reappeared overhead, but the pilot was clearly struggling with the terrain. The service road was cut so deeply into the hillside that the aircraft couldn't get a clear view of the truck without flying dangerously close to the rock walls. Thomas reached the top of the service road and found himself on a ridge overlooking the entire valley. From this vantage point, he could see the mill in the distance, still surrounded by the black SUVs and crawling with operatives. The scale of the operation was even larger than he had realized from ground level, but he could also see something else, a major highway about 5 miles to the east, with traffic flowing in both directions.
If he could reach that highway, he could disappear into the normal flow of civilian vehicles and make it much harder for his pursuers to maintain surveillance. The ridge road connected to another old mining track that descended the backside of the hill. Thomas took it without hesitation, leaving the helicopter behind as he plunged back into the forest canopy. The mining track was in worse condition than anything he had traveled so far. It had been abandoned for decades, and weather had carved deep gullies across its surface. Thomas had to reduce his speed dramatically to avoid damaging the truck, but the poor conditions also meant that his pursuers would face the same challenges. Ranger adjusted his position in the truck bed, maintaining his balance despite the increasingly rough ride. The dog's calm confidence was reassuring to Thomas, a reminder that they had faced worse situations together and survived. After 20 minutes of careful driving through increasingly difficult terrain, Thomas emerged from the forest onto a paved county road. He recognized the area. He was about 3 miles from the highway and had successfully evaded the immediate pursuit. But as he turned onto the county road, Thomas realized that his problems were far from over. The wooden crate on the passenger seat contained evidence that could destroy careers and topple governments. The people who had sent operatives to the mill wouldn't give up because he had escaped their initial net. They would regroup, expand their search and use every resource at their disposal to find him. He needed help, and he needed it from someone with the authority and courage to take on a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The problem was finding such a person without exposing himself to more danger. As Thomas drove toward the highway, his mind was already working on the next phase of his plan. The evidence in the crate was valuable, but it was also incomplete. The documents and photographs told part of the story, but they didn't provide the full scope of what had been hidden at the mill. According to the schematic he had found, there was still a sealed vault beneath the mill's foundation. That vault contained physical evidence of the radioactive waste that had been stored there, proof that would be much harder to dismiss or discredit than documents that could theoretically be forged. Thomas knew that eventually he would have to go back to the mill. Not today, not while it was swarming with operatives, but soon. The truth was still buried there, and until it was exposed, innocent people remained at risk. The highway appeared ahead, busy with afternoon traffic. Thomas merged into the flow of vehicles, just another pickup truck among hundreds of others. In the distance, he could still see the helicopter circling the area around the mill, but it was too far away to pose an immediate threat. For the moment he was safe, but Thomas knew that safety was temporary. He had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The $5 mill had cost him much more than money. It had cost him his anonymity and possibly his life. As he drove toward an uncertain future, Thomas felt Ranger's weight shift in the truck bed. The dog was standing now, alert and watchful, scanning the road ahead for new threats. Together they had uncovered a secret that powerful people had killed to protect. Now they had to find a way to survive long enough to tell the world what they had learned. The wooden crate beside him contained the first pieces of evidence, but Thomas suspected it was only the beginning. The Hartwell mill held more secrets, and somewhere in the halls of government, people were already planning how to silence the veteran who had bought an abandoned building for $5 and discovered that some prices were higher than they appeared. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pennsylvania countryside as Thomas drove deeper into an uncertain future. Behind him, the mill receded into the distance, but its secrets traveled with him in the form of a wooden crate and a dog who had learned to detect danger in all its forms. The real battle was just beginning, and Thomas Brennan was about to discover that some fights could never be won by military force alone. This was a war of information, credibility, and public trust in the enemy had spent decades learning how to fight it. But Thomas had one advantage that his enemies couldn't calculate or counter. He had Ranger, a partner who had never let him down and never would. Together they would find a way to expose the truth, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. The highway stretched ahead, leading toward a confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of everyone who lived downstream from the Hartwell mill. The secret was out, but the struggle to reveal it to the world was just beginning. In his rearview mirror, Thomas could see storm clouds building over the valley where the mill stood. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor for what was coming. The calm before the storm was ending, and soon the full fury of the government's response would be unleashed. Thomas pressed harder on the accelerator, knowing that every mile he put between himself and the mill increased his chances of survival. But he also knew that distance alone wouldn't save him. He needed allies, and he needed them soon. The wooden crate shifted slightly as the truck hit a bump in the road, reminding Thomas of the weight of responsibility he now carried. Inside that crate was evidence of crimes that reached back decades, proof of a cover-up that had put countless lives at risk. He had become the keeper of a terrible truth, and there was no going back. The $5 mill had changed his life forever, and now it was up to him to make sure that change led to justice rather than tragedy. Ranger settled back down in the truck bed, but his ears remained alert, constantly scanning for signs of danger. The dog understood that they were still in hostile territory, still being hunted by forces they couldn't see or predict. As the highway carried them away from the mill and toward an uncertain future, Thomas began to formulate a plan. He needed to find someone in authority who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or silenced. He needed someone with the courage to take on a conspiracy that had operated in secret for over 30 years. The challenge was finding such a person without exposing himself to more danger. Every contact he made, every phone call he placed, every email he sent could potentially alert his enemies to his location. He was walking a tightrope between exposure and silence, between justice and survival. But Thomas had walked similar tightropes in Afghanistan, making life and death decisions with incomplete information and uncertain allies. The skills that had kept him alive in a war zone might serve him well in this civilian conflict. The sun was setting as Thomas finally pulled off the highway at a truck stop 20 miles from the mill. He needed fuel, food, and most importantly, time to think about his next move. The parking lot was crowded with commercial vehicles, providing cover and anonymity. He filled the tank while Ranger stretched his legs in a small patch of grass behind the building. The dog's behavior had returned to normal, suggesting that the immediate threat had receded. But Thomas knew better than to assume they were truly safe. Inside the truck stop, Thomas bought supplies and studied the other customers. Truckers, traveling salesmen, families on vacation, all going about their normal lives, unaware that a few miles away, government operatives were covering up evidence of a crime that could affect them all. The weight of that knowledge was almost overwhelming. Thomas had spent his military career protecting people who would never know his name or understand the sacrifices made on their behalf. Now he found himself in a similar position, holding information that could save lives but at tremendous personal risk. As he walked back to his truck,
Thomas made his decision. He would not let fear silence him. He would not allow the conspiracy to continue unchallenged. Whatever the cost, he would find a way to expose the truth about the Hartwell Mill. The wooden crate was still on the passenger seat, its contents representing hope and danger in equal measure. Thomas started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, driving toward a future that would test everything he had learned about courage, loyalty, and the price of doing what was right. In the truck bed, Ranger rode with the quiet confidence of a dog who trusted his partner completely. That trust was about to be tested in ways neither of them could imagine, but Thomas was determined not to let his companion down. The battle for truth was about to escalate, and Thomas Brennan was ready to fight it. 3 days after escaping the mill, Thomas sat in a diner outside Harrisburg, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and studying the face of every person who walked through the door. He had driven through 2 states, paid cash for everything, and avoided using his credit cards or cell phone. The wooden crate sat in a storage unit 30 miles away, its contents digitally copied and stored in multiple secure locations. Ranger lay beneath the table, his presence a comforting weight against Thomas's legs. The dog had adapted to their fugitive lifestyle with the same professional calm he had shown during combat deployments. But Thomas could see the stress in his partner's eyes, the constant alertness that came from living under threat. The diner was perfect for their purposes, busy enough to provide anonymity, with multiple exits and clear sight lines to the parking lot. Thomas had chosen a booth in the back corner, where he could watch the entire restaurant while keeping his back to the wall. Old habits from dangerous places served him well in this new kind of warfare. His contact was late. Sarah Chen had been a war correspondent in Afghanistan when Thomas was serving his 2nd tour. She had earned the respect of soldiers by sharing their dangers and telling their stories with integrity and courage. Now she worked for the Washington Herald, investigating corruption and government misconduct with the same fearless determination she had shown in combat zones. Thomas had reached out to her through encrypted channels, using communication protocols they had established years earlier, when operational security meant the difference between life and death. If anyone could help him expose the truth about the Hartwell Mill, it was Sarah Chen. A woman in her late 30s entered the diner, scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. Sarah looked older than Thomas remembered, with premature gray streaking her black hair and lines around her dark eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent chasing dangerous stories. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, the kind of unremarkable clothing that would help her blend into any crowd. Her eyes found Thomas and she walked directly to his booth, sliding into the seat across from him without ceremony. Ranger lifted his head briefly, recognizing a familiar scent from years past, then settled back down with a soft sigh. "You look terrible," Sarah said by way of greeting. "When was the last time you slept?" "About 48 hours ago," Thomas replied. "Thanks for coming." Sarah studied his face with the same intensity she had once used to evaluate battlefield situations. "Your message was cryptic, but it got my attention. Government cover-up, radioactive waste, people dying to protect secrets. It sounds like the kind of story that could win Pulitzers or get people killed." Thomas nodded toward the parking lot where his truck sat among a dozen other vehicles. "The evidence is secure, but not here. Before I show you anything, you need to understand what you're getting into. The people behind this have unlimited resources and no scruples about eliminating threats." "I've been threatened by Taliban commanders and cartel bosses," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Government bureaucrats don't particularly scare me." "These aren't bureaucrats," Thomas said quietly. "These are intelligence operatives with congressional oversight and black budgets. They've been covering this up for over 30 years, and they've killed at least one person to keep it quiet." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Tell me everything." Thomas spent the next hour laying out the complete story, from his $5 purchase of the mill, to his discovery of the hidden evidence, to his narrow escape from the government response team. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in the shorthand she had developed during her war correspondent days. When Thomas finished, Sarah sat back in her booth, processing what she had heard. "The documents you found, you're certain they're authentic? Military classification stamps, official letterheads, sequential file numbers that match government protocols," Thomas said. "Either they're real, or someone went to extraordinary lengths to create perfect forgeries and hide them in a wall for 30 years.
And you think there's more evidence still at the mill? Thomas nodded. According to the schematic, there's a sealed vault beneath the foundation. Physical evidence of the radioactive materials they stored there. Soil samples, contaminated equipment, maybe even some of the original waste containers. Sarah made another note. That kind of evidence would be much harder to discredit than documents. But getting to it would mean going back to a site that's probably under constant surveillance. "I know," Thomas said. "But without that physical evidence, this is just another conspiracy theory. Documents can be dismissed as forgeries, photographs can be faked, witness testimony can be discredited. But Geiger counter readings and soil samples don't lie." Sarah looked out the window at the traffic flowing past the diner. "I've spent 10 years investigating government misconduct. I've seen cover-ups that reached the highest levels of power, watched good people destroyed for trying to tell the truth. This story, if it's real, is bigger than anything I've ever touched." "It's real," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "Ranger found that hidden cache because he was trained to detect explosive materials. Military working dogs are cross-trained in multiple specialties, including radiological detection. He was alerting to radiation signatures that had leached into the surrounding stone." Sarah studied the dog lying beneath the table. "He's been your early warning system this whole time. He saved our lives at the mill," Thomas confirmed. "Without his nose, we would have walked into that building and been captured or killed." Sarah made her decision. "I'll need to verify the documents independently, run background checks on the people named, cross-reference the timeline with other government activities from that period. But if this checks out, I'll run with the story." "There's something else," Thomas said. "The contamination from the mill flows into the Susquehanna River. According to the geological surveys in those documents, the groundwater contamination has been spreading for 30 years. People living downstream have been exposed to radiation without knowing it." Sarah's expression hardened. "Cancer clusters, birth defects, elevated mortality rates. If this contamination is as extensive as you think, it's not just a cover-up, it's an ongoing public health disaster. Which is why we can't wait for perfect evidence," Thomas said. "Every day we delay is another day that innocent people are being exposed." Sarah pulled out a secure satellite phone, one of the encrypted devices used by journalists working in hostile territories. "I'm going to make some calls, reach out to sources who can help verify your story. But I need those documents." Thomas gave her the address of the storage facility and the access code. "Everything's in a fireproof safe, originals and copies. I also uploaded digital versions to multiple secure servers using different encryption protocols." "Smart," Sarah approved. "Distributed redundancy makes it almost impossible to suppress evidence completely." As they prepared to leave the diner, Sarah touched Thomas's arm. "There's something you should know. My editor killed a story last year about illegal weapons testing at a government facility in Nevada. The pressure came from way up the chain, higher than anyone wanted to admit. If this Hartwell Mill story is as big as I think it is, we're going to face the same kind of pressure." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that exposing this truth might require more than just good journalism," Sarah said. "It might require going outside normal channels, finding ways to get the information directly to the public without depending on traditional media gatekeepers." Thomas understood. The same forces that had covered up the mill for 30 years would try to suppress any story about it. They needed a plan that didn't depend on the cooperation of news organizations that could be pressured or intimidated. "I have an idea about that," Thomas said. "But first we need to get that physical evidence from the vault." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You're seriously considering going back to the mill?" "I don't see another option," Thomas replied. The documents tell part of the story, but they're 30 years old. We need current evidence, proof that the contamination is ongoing and immediate. That's suicide, Sarah said bluntly. The place will be crawling with security. Not necessarily, Thomas said. They can't maintain a massive security presence indefinitely without drawing attention. Eventually, they'll scale back to a smaller surveillance operation. That's when we make our move. Sarah studied his face, seeing the determination that had carried him through multiple combat deployments. You're really going to do this? We're going to do this. We're going to do this, Thomas corrected. I need someone with your skills to document everything properly. Video evidence, proper chain of custody, the kind of documentation that will hold up under scrutiny. And I need someone with your skills to get us in and out alive, Sarah admitted. When do we go? Thomas looked at his watch. Give me 48 hours to scout the area and assess their security posture. Then we'll know what we're up against. They parted ways outside the diner, Sarah heading back to Washington to begin verifying the documents, while Thomas drove toward a cheap motel where he could plan the most dangerous operation of his civilian life. That night, lying on a lumpy mattress in a room that smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes, Thomas studied satellite images of the mill area on his laptop. Ranger stretched out on the floor beside the bed, his breathing deep and regular, but his ears still rotating toward every sound from the parking lot. The satellite photos showed the mill exactly as Thomas remembered it, but they also revealed details he had missed during his escape. There were new structures around the building, temporary facilities that looked like command posts and equipment storage. The government response was more extensive than he had realized, but the photos also showed something else. The mill was surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with the creek providing natural concealment on the 4th. There were multiple approach routes that wouldn't be visible from the main building, paths that could bring someone close to the mill without being detected by conventional surveillance. Thomas had spent years studying similar terrain in Afghanistan, learning to move through hostile territory without being seen. The skills that had kept him alive in a war zone could serve him equally well in the Pennsylvania countryside. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Sarah. The documents had passed initial authentication tests. The paper, ink and printing methods all matched government standards from the 1980s. More importantly, the names and organizations mentioned in the files were checking out through independent sources. The story was real. Now they needed to prove it. The next morning, Thomas drove back toward Millerville, taking a circuitous route that kept him well away from the mill itself. He needed to observe the government operation from a distance, assess their security protocols, and identify the best approach route for their infiltration. He found a position on a hillside about 2 miles from the mill, concealed among a stand of pine trees that provided excellent cover. Through binoculars, he could see the mill building and the surrounding area clearly. The government operation was smaller than it had been 3 days earlier, but still substantial. Thomas counted 6 vehicles parked around the mill, including 2 that looked like mobile command centers. Personnel moved in and out of the building in regular patterns, suggesting ongoing operations inside. A helicopter made periodic flights over the area, but the intervals were predictable enough to time an approach between overflights. Most importantly, Thomas could see that the security perimeter was focused on the main access roads and the immediate area around the mill. The backside of the building, where the creek ran close to the foundation, appeared to be less heavily guarded. That evening, Thomas met Sarah at a truck stop 50 miles from the mill. She had spent the day gathering additional information about the government agencies involved in the cover-up, building a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy they were preparing to expose. I've identified at least 12 people who were directly involved in the original operation, Sarah reported. 3 of them are dead, 2 from apparent heart attacks and 1 from a car accident. The rest have moved into senior positions in various government agencies. Convenient deaths, Thomas observed. That's what I thought, Sarah agreed. But here's the interesting part. One of the surviving participants retired from government service 5 years ago and now works for a non-profit environmental organization. I think he might be willing to talk. Thomas considered this development. A cooperative witness could provide crucial corroboration for their evidence, adding credibility to their eventual disclosure. Can you arrange a meeting? Already working on it, Sarah said. But he's scared. 30 years of keeping quiet doesn't end easily. They spent the next hour finalizing their plan for infiltrating the mill. Thomas had identified an approach route that would bring them within 50 yards of the building, while remaining concealed in the creek bed. From there they could reach the mill during the gap between helicopter patrols. The vault entrance should be inside the mill, near the water wheel mechanism, Thomas explained, showing Sarah the schematic from the documents. According to this diagram, it's hidden behind a removable section of the stone foundation. How long will we need inside the building? 15 minutes to locate and open the vault, another 15 to document the contents and collect samples, Thomas estimated. 30 minutes total, assuming we don't run into complications. We'll run into complications, Sarah said with the voice of experience.
We always do. Thomas nodded. Ranger will give us early warning if anyone approaches. He can detect people at much greater distances than any human surveillance system. The next night was moonless and cloudy, perfect conditions for their operation. Thomas and Sarah met at a parking area 5 miles from the mill, transferring their equipment to Thomas's truck before driving to a concealed position near the creek. They moved through the darkness with the careful precision of people who understood that mistakes could be fatal. Thomas led, using night vision equipment to navigate the rough terrain, while Sarah followed with the specialized cameras and sampling equipment they would need to document their discoveries. Ranger moved like a ghost through the underbrush, his black and tan coat making him nearly invisible in the darkness. The dog ranged ahead of their small column, checking for threats and obstacles that might impede their progress. The creek bed provided excellent concealment, but the going was slow and treacherous. They had to move carefully to avoid splashing or dislodging stones that might alert the guards. Every sound seemed amplified in the still night air. After 40 minutes of careful movement, they reached the position Thomas had identified during his reconnaissance. The mill loomed above them, dark and silent, except for a few lighted windows on the first floor. They could see guards moving inside the building, their silhouettes visible against the window glass. Thomas checked his watch. The helicopter wasn't due for another 20 minutes, giving them a narrow window to reach the mill and get inside. He signaled to Sarah, and they began the final approach. The rear of the mill was exactly as Thomas remembered it, with the water wheel creating deep shadows that concealed their movement. They reached the building without incident and found the window Thomas had used for his earlier escape. The window was now secured with new hardware, but Thomas had expected this. He used a glass cutter to create a small opening near the latch, then reached through to unlock the window from inside. Within minutes, they were climbing into the mill's second floor. The interior was different from Thomas's previous visit. New equipment had been installed, including what looked like radiation detection devices and air filtration systems. The government operation was clearly ongoing, not just a cleanup effort. They made their way to the first floor, moving silently through the maze of old mill equipment. Ranger stayed close, his senses constantly monitoring for approaching threats. The dog's calm demeanor suggested they remained undetected. The stone foundation along the north wall looked exactly as it had in the schematic. Thomas examined the area carefully, running his hands over the stones until he found the section that felt different from the others. Like the hidden cache he had discovered earlier, this section had been carefully disguised, but not perfectly. Working together, Thomas and Sarah used pry bars to loosen the removable stones. The work was slow and required extreme care to avoid making noise that might alert the guards. After 20 minutes of patient effort, they had opened a hole large enough to climb through. Thomas shined his flashlight into the opening and found himself looking at a staircase carved into the bedrock beneath the mill. The stairs descended into darkness, leading to the vault that had been sealed for 30 years. The descent was treacherous. The stone steps were slick with moisture and covered with debris that had accumulated over the decades.
But at the bottom, they found what they had come for. The vault was larger than Thomas had expected, carved out of solid rock and lined with concrete. Along the walls were dozens of metal containers, each one marked with radiation warning symbols and government identification codes. Many of the containers showed signs of corrosion and leakage. Sarah immediately began documenting everything with her camera, capturing images of the containers, the warning labels, and the evidence of radioactive leakage. Thomas used a handheld radiation detector to measure the contamination levels, finding readings that were dangerously high throughout the vault. But the most disturbing discovery was in the center of the vault. A large concrete structure, cracked and deteriorating, contained what appeared to be the most dangerous materials from the original storage operation. The radiation detector went crazy when Thomas approached it, registering levels that would be lethal with extended exposure. "This is worse than the documents indicated," Sarah whispered, continuing to photograph the scene. "They didn't just store radioactive materials here. They created a concentrated disposal site that's been leaking for decades." Thomas collected soil and water samples from various locations in the vault, sealing them in specially designed containers that would preserve their integrity for scientific analysis. The evidence they were gathering would be impossible to dispute or discredit. As they prepared to leave the vault, Ranger suddenly appeared at the top of the stairs, whining softly in the signal that meant imminent danger. Thomas and Sarah gathered their equipment quickly and climbed toward the surface. At the top of the stairs, Thomas could hear what had alarmed Ranger. Vehicles were approaching the mill, their engines growing louder as they navigated the access road. The security shift was changing, bringing fresh personnel who might notice signs of their infiltration. They climbed out of the vault and began replacing the stones, working frantically to conceal evidence of their presence. Sarah continued photographing the restoration process, documenting their efforts to leave the site undisturbed. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the front of the mill. Thomas and Sarah moved quickly toward their escape route, climbing back through the second-floor window just as footsteps echoed in the building below. The return journey through the creek bed was a nightmare of tension and careful movement. They could hear activity at the mill behind them, voices and footsteps that suggested a thorough security check was underway. But their concealment held, and after an hour of careful movement, they reached their vehicle without being detected. Back in the truck, driving away from the mill with their precious evidence, Thomas felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. They had succeeded in gathering proof that the government conspiracy was real and ongoing. But they had also confirmed that the danger was immediate and extensive. "The radiation levels in that vault are off the charts," Thomas said, as they drove through the pre-dawn darkness. "The contamination has to be spreading through the groundwater system, which means people living downstream are being exposed right now," Sarah added. "This isn't just a historical cover-up anymore. It's an active public health crisis." The evidence they had gathered would form the foundation of a story that could bring down careers and possibly entire government agencies. But getting that story published would require navigating a system designed to suppress exactly this kind of information. Over the next week, Sarah worked with a network of independent journalists and citizen investigators to build an unassailable case. The soil samples were analyzed by 3 different laboratories, all confirming dangerous levels of radioactive contamination. The photographs and video evidence were authenticated by digital forensics experts. Most importantly, the retired government official Sarah had contacted agreed to provide testimony about the original operation. Dr. Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, had been a young engineer in the Department of Energy when the Hartwell Mill operation began. 30 years of guilt had finally overcome his fear of retaliation. "I've watched people die from cancers that I knew were caused by our contamination," Dr. Chen said during a recorded interview. "I can't stay silent anymore. The public deserves to know what we did and what's still happening." The story broke simultaneously across multiple platforms, making it impossible for government censors to suppress.
Sarah's article in the Washington Herald was accompanied by a documentary posted on multiple video platforms. Citizen journalist reports on social media, and a coordinated campaign by environmental organizations. The response was immediate and explosive. Congressional committees announced investigations. The Environmental Protection Agency promised a comprehensive cleanup, and the Department of Justice began criminal proceedings against surviving participants in the cover-up. But the most important result was the emergency response to the ongoing contamination. Within days of the story's publication, teams of environmental specialists descended on the Hartwell Mill and the surrounding area. The contaminated vault was sealed with modern materials, and water treatment systems were installed to prevent further spread of radioactive materials. Thomas watched the news coverage from a safe house that Sarah had arranged, knowing that his life remained in danger until the full truth was exposed. Ranger lay beside him on the couch, finally relaxed for the first time since their adventure began. The $5 mill had cost Thomas much more than he had ever expected. It had destroyed his anonymity, endangered his life, and thrust him into a battle with forces far more powerful than himself. But it had also given him something invaluable, the knowledge that he had helped protect innocent people from a deadly secret. Months later, after the immediate danger had passed and the major conspirators had been arrested, Thomas returned to the mill for the first time since their infiltration. The government operation was gone, replaced by environmental remediation teams working to clean up the contamination. The mill itself was being demolished, its radioactive stones and timber disposed of as hazardous waste. But the water wheel remained, restored and functional, turning slowly in the creek that now ran clean for the first time in 30 years. Sarah met him there carrying a copy of the Pulitzer Prize she had won for her investigation of the Hartwell Mill conspiracy. "They want to put up a memorial here," she said, gesturing toward the space where the mill had stood. "Something to honor the people who were affected by the contamination." Thomas nodded, thinking of Edwin Hartwell and the unknown observer who had documented the original conspiracy. "They deserve to be remembered." Ranger explored the area where the mill had stood, sniffing at the cleaned soil with the thoroughness that had made him such an effective detection dog. Finding nothing dangerous, he returned to Thomas's side with his tail wagging. "What's next for you?" Sarah asked. Thomas looked around the valley, watching the environmental teams continue their cleanup work. "I think I'll stay in Pennsylvania, find another piece of land, maybe build a house this time instead of buying someone else's secrets." "And if you stumble into another conspiracy?" Thomas smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Sarah had seen on his face since their first meeting. "I'll have Ranger to warn me, and I'll know to call you." As they walked back toward their vehicles, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning when he had bid $5 for an abandoned mill. He had sought solitude and found purpose. He had tried to escape from the world and instead found himself at the center of a fight for truth and justice. The mill was gone, but its legacy would endure in the lives saved by their investigation. Sometimes, Thomas realized, the most expensive purchases were the ones that seemed free, and the most valuable discoveries were the ones you never intended to make. Ranger trotted ahead of them toward the truck, his professional duty complete, but his personal loyalty eternal. Together, they had proven that some secrets were too dangerous to keep buried, and some truths were worth any price to reveal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.